All right, everyone. So welcome back. And so following on from our lesson last week about fluvial processes, we're going to continue to talk about water with a focus today on flooding. So our goals for this lesson are first simply to appreciate the variability of our natural world, then to understand how floods are measured, to calculate the flood risk to particular locations, and finally to evaluate measures for managing floods. So to begin with kind of a larger picture conception here, the natural world is extremely variable. Nature varies over time in terms of the land, the water, the ecosystems. All of these things are constantly changing. We learned about plate tectonics that the entire land of the world is always moving. It doesn't stay in one place. It's constantly being reshaped. We have erosion and deposition going on all the time. So water and wind are constantly reshaping the world that we live in. So we talk about things being set in stone or people having their feet firmly on the ground, but stone and the ground, those aren't permanent things. They're going to change over time, more slowly perhaps than some other things, but everything is always changing, and sometimes quite drastically. So I have as an illustration there a graph of rainfall for the town of Bungaree, Australia, and you can see how the rainfall varies wildly just from one year to the next. Huge ups and downs in the amount of rainfall received in this town. So, speaking in very broad terms, pre-industrial societies adapted to these kinds of changes. They would shift their way of life along with these natural cycles. They would move where people were living. They would change what kinds of crops they were growing and use other strategies to deal with the variability of nature. But as we've moved into modern industrial type societies, we've gotten less able to handle that variability. We need stable, predictable nature in order to be able to maximize our production and maximize the generation of profits and so forth. It's becoming harder to cope with nature being variable and unpredictable, while at the same time, the effects of industrial society are actually causing nature to become more unstable and more unpredictable. And in the final portion of our class, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about one major way that modern industrial societies have caused nature to become more unpredictable, more unstable, which is climate change. So there's a kind of irony here that industrialized societies want nature to be stable and predictable and always the same, but are actually making it less stable and less predictable. So if we put this principle into the context of hydrology, since that's our current area of focus, water levels in streams are also highly variable. They go up and down on seasonal cycles. They have variation between years in the height of stream flow. And many ecosystems and cultures actually depend on this variability, that there are important elements of ecosystem processes that occur when streams get unusually high or unusually low, and cultures adapt to make use of those changes. But just as I was saying on the previous slide, modern industrial societies would prefer to even out stream levels so that streams flow at roughly the same level all the time, so that the amount of water in that stream is very predictable. And as an illustration of this process, I've got a picture there of the Aswan High Dam on the Nile River. So this is upstream in Egypt. And so for millennia, the people of Egypt have depended on the Nile River having an annual flood. So people live right along the banks of the Nile River, and every year, because of the climate in the areas where rainfall is feeding into the Nile River. It's a very seasonal precipitation pattern. So the Nile River would rise for part of the year, flood all the land along its banks, but then drop down for the other part of the year. And this was important to farmers living along the Nile because when the Nile would flood, it would deposit sediment on its banks, and that sediment would be good for farming. It was what allowed farmers in Egypt to grow enormous amounts of crops along its banks because their soil was getting refreshed every year by the flooding of the Nile, and then the flooding would also soak water into the soil so that when the plants grew, they had water to draw on. So the flooding cycle was very important to people. The downside to that flooding cycle is then people would have to get out of the way when the Nile River flooded. People couldn't build the kind of permanent houses and roads and buildings and stuff that we expect as part of a modern industrialized society because it would be potentially damaged every year by that flood. So the government of Egypt built this dam across the Nile River. And so the dam would allow them to hold back water when the water level rose and then let that out when the water level was lower. And it would even out the flow of the stream downstream of the dam, make that water level in the Nile River very predictable. They could control it with the dam letting out water, holding back water to even things out. So that was nice in the sense that now nobody was getting flooded every year. You didn't have to worry about damage to buildings and so forth. The downside is now the river was no longer depositing that sediment on all of the fields. And so farmers in Egypt now had to turn to artificial fertilizers in order to keep their fields productive. So nature was no longer fertilizing their fields for them. They had to purchase fertilizers, mostly made out of petrochemicals, to be able to continue to grow their crops. Meanwhile, all of that sediment that used to get deposited on people's fields was building up behind the dam. The dam slows that water down to nothing, and so it drops all of that sediment behind the dam. And so now there are problems with the dam basically filling up with all of that sediment that it's preventing from going downstream. So there are benefits to floods. Floods can be advantageous for ecosystems and for people, but of course they're also potentially major hazards for people. So we want to just run through some of the major ways that floods can cause harm and damage. So the first and most obvious one, of course, is you could drown. Right? You could get trapped under the floodwaters and not be able to breathe and die. But that's not the biggest hazard that floods present. Another important hazardous element to a flood is that people and property get swept away by the waters flowing through the flood. So a lot of floods are hitting not just the area where, say, a whole lot of rainfall is falling and causing the waters to rise, but those waters are going to flow downstream and hit areas where there might not be any of that rain happening. And so you get this massive rush of water moving downstream. So it's not just sort of quietly rising up onto everyone's house, but it's just going to rush in really dramatically with a whole lot of force. And so that can drag away people, property, cars, houses, anything that's in the path of those floodwaters. And then all of those things being carried along by the flood become then themselves hazards. You know, a tree that's been uprooted by a flood now becomes a battering ram against anything that it hits as it moves downstream. You also have problems with pollutants in floodwaters. So as that flood is rising up, it's picking up any gunk that it comes into contact with. And so there can be a lot of really nasty stuff in the floodwaters depending on what kind of, buildings have been flooded, what kinds of stuff might be in those. You get sewage getting into floodwaters. You get various sorts of chemicals from industrial facilities, anything that waters flood out, that gets picked up by the water and it gets moved along. And so anybody that comes in contact with that water could be harmed by that, and it may be left behind as residue when the waters finally recede. We also have water damage to structures and property. So if your house gets flooded, like you see with the houses here in this picture, this is a flood event that happened in Harmony, Pennsylvania, just down the road from us at Slippery Rock just a few years ago. Once that water recedes, there's potential for significant water damage to all the parts of those houses that are underwater. So that water has seeped into the structure, into the brickwork, into the wood, into the carpet, everything that's under there, under the water, has that water, that really dirty water with all kinds of nasty stuff in it, seeping into it. And that can cause some pretty serious damage. And then the last major hazardous impact of a flood that I want to mention is that floods can accelerate erosion and deposition. When you've got a lot of water moving with a lot of force, that can cause a lot of erosion in some places. It can accelerate the process of moving material away from one location. And then those floodwaters are going to deposit that material in other locations. So you'll get big areas of sediment deposited in places where the floodwaters have slowed down. So depending on whether you're in the path of very fast-moving floodwaters or slow-moving floodwaters, you might get enhanced erosion or enhanced deposition. And we mentioned in the last lesson that flooding can really help to accelerate that process by which the neck of a meander gets cut through and the outer part of the meander gets stranded as an oxbow, because if the floodwaters are moving with a lot of force, they can sort of blast through that thin neck of land there. So that's an example of that accelerated erosion that can accompany a flood. So when we're looking at floods, we want to be able to measure them. We want to be able to talk about how big of a flood we're experiencing. And so the best piece of data to have about a flood in order to describe the size of the flood is the discharge. So the discharge of a stream is the rate at which water moves past a certain point in the channel. So you've got a spot in the stream, how much water moves past that spot within a given amount of time. And we usually measure that in cubic feet per second or cubic meters per second, depending on whether we're working with the imperial or the metric system. When we're talking about things like floods, because there's a lot of civil engineering that gets involved in these, we will sometimes use the imperial system rather than doing everything metric like scientists like to do. So discharge would be a nice thing to know. It's the amount of water that's coming through. But discharge can be very hard to measure if you don't have exactly the right equipment installed at a given location. It's much easier to measure what we call the stage of the flood. So the stage is the height of the surface of the water above a reference point, what we consider the normal stream level. And so then how much higher it goes above that reference point is the stage of the flood. And that's very easy to measure. All you need is some sort of a stick or a wall that's vertical, and then you mark numbers on it. And then anybody can go by and they can see which number that water has come up to. And you'll see that in the picture there, that they've got those numbers just painted along the side of the bridge abutment there, so that anybody can very easily see what stage the flood is at if that stream were to flood. The downside to talking in terms of flood stage is that there's no linear relationship between stage and discharge, because it's going to depend on the shape of the valley that you're in. If you've got a very narrow valley with very steep sides, it doesn't take a lot of additional discharge, a lot of additional water moving past that point to raise the level of the surface of that stream up to the next level on your gauge. But if you have a very wide valley, then it's going to take a lot of water to raise the surface up a little more. And if your valley is weird shaped, if it's narrower at some points and wider at other points, you're going to get all kinds of odd relationships between the discharge level and the flood stage. So stage is easy to measure, but it's doesn't necessarily directly tell us about the amount of water that we're seeing. And then finally, the peak of a flood is the highest stage or the highest discharge that's reached by the stream during a particular flood event. So during a particular flood, what's the highest that the water got to? That's your peak. So you'll sometimes hear floods talked about in terms of years. You'll hear things like 100-year flood. What that really means is that it's a flood with a 1 in 100 chance of occurring in any given year. So we would expect that we would have a 1% chance of getting a flood that reaches or exceeds a certain level, and we call that a 100-year flood. And hydrologists have been moving away from this kind of terminology because it can be misleading. It can imply that floods are on kind of a schedule, that you would expect to see a 100-year flood every 100 years. So if you haven't had one of that size in 100 years, then you're kind of overdue, and it's more likely to happen in the coming year. Or if you already had one, you had a 100-year flood yet last year, well, then now you're good for a while. You've had your 100-year flood, and another one's not going to come. That is not true. That is a misunderstanding of the terminology, but it's kind of an easy mistake. You can see how people would make that mistake. So a lot of hydrologists have moved away from using that terminology of the whatever year flood, and rather they would like to talk about what we call the exceedance probability. So that is the percentage chance that you would see a flood of that height in a given year. And you can see in the chart there the correspondence between the return interval, which is the whatever years expression, and the exceedance probability. So a 100-year flood means the same as a 1% chance to get a flood that big or higher in a given year. A 50-year flood means that you have a 2% chance of getting a flood that big or higher during a given year. A 500-year flood means you have a 0.2% chance of getting a flood that big or higher in a given year. And so to determine all of this, we look at a database of past flood levels. So we take existing data on the biggest floods that have happened in each year as far back as we have records to go, and we can use that to calculate how likely a flood of a certain size would be at this location that we have this data for. So here's an example of how we would do that calculation. So you start by getting a database of the biggest flood each year for as many years as you have for your place that you're trying to calculate the return interval or the exceedance probability for. So I've got, just as an example here, this is 11 years of data from the Siletz River in Oregon from 1989 to 1999. And so we've got the year, and then you've got the peak flood discharge. So at this location, we actually have the discharge data, not just the staged data, right? So it's just the amount of water in cubic feet per second that was moving past this measuring point at the highest that it got to during the biggest flood that year. So here we've got 11 years of data to work with. Lots of places you have a lot more data than this, but this keeps it simple for this illustration. Second thing you do is you're going to rank these floods from highest to lowest. So your highest flood you call a 1, your second highest a 2, etc., down to whatever your last rank is. So in this case, we have 11 years of data. So our year whose highest flood was the lowest out of all these years gets an 11. So you can see that if you look at those numbers. Right, the peak flood in 1999, that was 40,000 cubic feet per second. That's the biggest flood on this list, so it gets a 1. The second biggest flood on this list was in 1996. So you had 34,700 cubic feet per second, so that gets a 2. And on down, in 1992, their biggest flood was 10,800 cubic feet per second. That's the lowest, biggest flood on this list, so that gets the 11. So we've got the ranks listed for each of these years. And then you're going to apply the formula Ri equals n plus 1 over m. And so what that means is Ri is the return interval. Okay? So that's the X year flood kind of expression. That's equal to the number of years of data you have plus 1. So in this case, we've got 12 years of data. So n plus 1 would be, we've got 11 years of data. So n plus 1 equals 12. And then you divide by m, which is the rank of each year. So you're running this formula for each year. So for 1989, we're taking 12 divided by 9 because that was the 9th ranked year, and that gives us 1.33. Right? So that's a 1 1/3 year flood. And then 1990 is ranked 7, so 12 divided by 7 gives you 1.71, etc. And so we see in this particular example, our biggest flood of the database is going to come out to being a 12-year flood. So that may not sound very impressive, right? That's the size of flood that we expect to be that big or bigger every 12 years. But then what we can do once we have these calculations is that we can calculate a trend line that allows us to extrapolate to rarer flood events that we have not yet experienced, or that we haven't experienced within the time frame that we have data for. So here we see I've put those numbers on a graph. So on the vertical axis, the y-axis, that is the return intervals. So that's the X year flood information. And then on the horizontal axis, the x-axis, you've got the discharge amounts. And one thing you may notice looking at this chart is the discharge amounts, it's not a linear scale, it's a logarithmic scale. And this is because the bigger the flood, the rarer it's going to be. So rather than a linear scale, we're using a logarithmic scale. So you can see the intervals there, right? You go 0 to 10, to 100, to 1,000, to 10,000, 100,000, etc. So that's what's going on that x-axis of the chart. So once we've got things graphed on this chart, we can put a trend line through the middle, and we can statistically calculate exactly the how that trend line should go there, and we can generate an equation for that. And we have computers to tell us that equation. You're not going to have to work it through by hand. But then we can either just eyeball from the chart or use that equation and plug numbers in if we wanted to see, how big would a 100-year flood at this particular location be? Or how big would a 25-year flood at this location be? All we have to do is extend the graph far enough out and draw our trend line in, and then we can read it off the graph, or again, we can apply that equation to calculate it exactly. So that's how we would measure floods. But where do these floods come from? Well, floods generally will start with excessive rainfall. We get more rainfall than usual, excessive precipitation, and that's going to produce flooding in our streams. You can also have floods if there's a sudden release of water from some other source. If a dam breaks, for example, that's going to release all the water that was held back by that dam, and that applies to both dams constructed by people, like the Aswan Dam that we saw earlier. That would be very destructive if that dam were to fail and send all of that water downstream through the Nile. It also applies to natural dams. So, for example, as you were looking at those topographic maps of Slippery Rock, you may have noticed that there are some narrow gorges that Slippery Rock Creek goes through. Those were actually carved out by floodwaters that were released when glacial ice melted. So there was a whole lot of water that got trapped behind some ice during the last ice age, and it basically burst out all at once, and the force of that floodwater carved that gorge that Slippery Rock Creek flows through for part of its length. So you can have a flood from a sudden release of water like that, but most floods are the result of high levels of precipitation upstream of the point that gets flooded. So the amount of water that we're going to get from a large precipitation event is a function of three main factors. So first is the intensity of the rainfall. How much rain is falling over a given period of time for a given area. So the amount of water that's actually falling from the air, from the clouds, that's your intensity of rainfall. Then you've got your drainage area. So over how much land is this rainfall falling that is part of the watershed that would drain down to our point that we're interested in calculating the flood for. So basically the watershed upstream of that point where all of this rainfall is occurring. So obviously a bigger watershed feeding down to a certain point, you've got more water that's going to come down, and so you're going to get a bigger flood. Then the third factor that we have to take into consideration is what's called the runoff coefficient. And so this is basically a measurement of what percent of the rain that is actually falling is going to run off into the stream. Because not all of the rain that falls on the ground is going to run off into the nearest stream. Some of it is going to soak into the ground. So it's not immediately going to move into our stream and contribute to flooding. The runoff coefficient is a very tricky thing to work with. So the intensity of rainfall is relatively easy to measure if you have a rain gauge. Drainage area, very easy to measure, just look at a map. But runoff coefficient is highly variable. And so it's going to, every different point in our watershed might have a different runoff coefficient because it depends on things like the slope of the land, the surface cover. So I've got a picture there where you can see a drain with some grass around it and a bit of a pavement like a parking lot. Grass is going to allow water to get into the soil below it. Right? And so less water is going to run directly off of that grass, whereas an impervious surface like pavement, all the water that falls on that pavement is going to run off of it. It just can't soak through that pavement. So you're going to get different runoff coefficients depending on if you've got a hard impervious cover like pavement or the roof of a house or something, versus if you've got something like a forest or a lawn or something where that water is able to reach the soil. It's also going to depend on the soil type. Some types of soil can absorb a lot of water. Other types don't absorb water very well. And it'll also depend on the existence of drainage infrastructure, like that drain that you see there in the picture, because that will modify where that water goes and how it gets piped out to any stream that drainage is connected to. So here's an illustration of how changes in that runoff coefficient can alter the size of a flood. One of the things that we often see is that urbanization, so building roads and parking lots and buildings and all these other sort of human structures, tend to result in bigger and faster flooding downstream, so down the watershed from where this urbanization occurs. So what you're seeing on this graph, the bars represent a period of rainfall. So we get a whole bunch of rain falling for a while, and then the pinkish lines there represent the stream discharge at whatever point we're measuring it. And so this is over this period of time. So you'll see that the stream discharge begins to rise when the rainfall starts to happen. Eventually after the rainfall ends, it continues to rise as the rain that has already fallen continues to run off, but eventually it peaks and then it comes back down. The dotted line is a non-urbanized landscape, so primarily rural landscape. That's going to be a landscape that has mostly non-impervious ground covers. That's going to be, grass and forests and other, natural type of ground cover. The solid line shows what happens when this landscape is urbanized, when we replace those forests and grass and so forth with hard surfaces like parking lots and roads and buildings and so forth. And so you'll see what happens is that when we put all those impervious things on the ground, that means first that the peak of that flooding happens quicker. So the water just immediately runs off those hard surfaces into the streams. It doesn't soak into the ground first. And the peak is much higher. So a larger percentage of that water goes right into those streams. Whereas if you have a lot of surfaces that water can soak into, the ground is going to soak up a bunch of that water, so it's going to slow down the movement of water into the stream. It's going to lower that peak, and it's going to stretch out the time that that stream is moving that water away. So instead of getting a sudden and very large flood, you get a little bit more elevated water levels stretched out over a longer time. So putting those impervious ground covers down can really worsen flooding downstream of that area. So what can we do about flooding? Right, if we've got a flooding risk to an area, what are some of the measures that we might adopt to protect people from it? One such measure is building a levee. So a levee is essentially just a wall that holds back floodwaters. And so that's, a pretty straightforward thing to do. Just build a wall to keep the floods off of your area, and it can be very effective. But there are a few potential downsides to relying on levees. First is that it will be catastrophic if it's breached or overtopped. So if that levee were to break, and then all those floodwaters would come pouring through that break, or if the flood were just to get so high that it rises above the height of the levee and spills over the top, then you've got a catastrophe for everybody that's on the other side, something probably worse than if the levee hadn't been there and the water had just sort of more slowly risen up. There was a lot of damage done in New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina because there were levees in certain parts of the city, predominantly in the poorer neighborhoods that were not as well maintained, and so they broke, and this really harsh floodwaters ripped through them down into these neighborhoods. So if you build a levee, you better hope that it holds. A levee in one place can also funnel the floodwaters towards vulnerable areas that don't have levees. So if you've got several towns along the side of a river and one of the towns builds a nice big levee and the town downstream of them does not, maybe they can't afford to do it, then all the floodwaters that might have gone into the town with the levee now just get pushed downstream onto the people that don't have a levee. So by protecting yourself with a levee, you might worsen the flood for somebody else. And then building a levee can encourage development in dangerous areas. So a levee can give people a false sense of security that, oh, we've got the levee there, it'll hold back the floodwaters, and so we're fine to build on these low-lying areas that had been susceptible to flooding. Once you get a lot of people building in those areas, then the risk if the levee were to fail is now much higher. And you can kind of see that in that picture. The floodwaters there on the right side are clearly higher up than the road and houses to the left side. So if that levee were to fail, there's a lot of people in the pathway of those floodwaters. Another thing you might do is flood-resistant architecture. Build your house in a way that's less likely to get damaged by a flood. And so one common way to do that is to raise a house up. The higher the house is, the higher the flood has to be to do any serious damage. So you might see a house on stilts like you see in the picture there, or just on a really tall foundation. The downsides to something like this are that it's expensive. It's costly to do that in new construction, and it may be essentially impossible to do that if you're trying to retrofit existing buildings. To take an existing building and to jack it up high enough and, put stilts under it or something, that may just not be possible for some existing buildings. So you would have to either not do this, or you'd have to tear the whole building down and build it from scratch, which is obviously going to be very expensive. And there's also trade-offs to this type of architecture. So this house, for example, has no basement. And there's basically not any way to make a basement entirely flood-proof. If you've got a serious flood in your area, you're going to get water in the basement, no matter what you do to it. So if you're trying to build your house to be flood-proof, you can't have a basement. You also have to have, potentially big steps getting up to the house, like you see here. Which could be difficult for people to navigate, right? And older people that don't do stairs well, for example, would be a significant drawback in their case. Another way to manage floods is to protect, restore, create wetlands. So we have wetlands along a lot of different rivers, and they can basically absorb floodwaters. Floodwaters spread out into these wetlands. They act like a giant sponge and soak up a bunch of that water and then slowly release it in smaller amounts back into the channel. So they reduce the peak of the flooding by stretching out the flow of that water over a longer period of time. Essentially, what they're doing is altering that runoff coefficient. So you've got a lot of water moving down the stream, a bunch of it soaks into the wetland, that slows it down. So wetlands can play a very important role in reducing damage from flooding. The downside is, well, first, all that land that is being kept as wetlands or being turned into artificial wetlands is land that's not available for other types of development. And it may be prime real estate. It's right there along the river. That may be a very desirable place for people to build lots of different things. But you can't do that if you've set that land aside as wetlands. And there's also just the general prejudice against swamps. We think of swamps as like bad places. We don't like swamps. They're full of, disease and dangerous animals, and they smell gross and all these kinds of things. We have this cultural prejudice against swamps that leads people to overlook the benefits that wetlands can have for a variety of reasons, flood control being one very prominent one. Another thing you might do is to buy flood insurance. So the way that flood insurance works is basically the way any insurance system is supposed to work, that everyone pays a little bit every year to keep their insurance policy, and then the company will take that money that they're getting and use it to do big payouts to those few customers who actually suffer whatever sort of disaster in that year. So the few people that actually get flooded get these payouts that are based on the payments that everybody has been making to the insurance system. This is actually a federal requirement for homes in the 100-year floodplain. So if you are in an area that the government has calculated would be affected by a 100-year flood, you are required to buy flood insurance as a condition of, say, getting a mortgage to buy a house. So I recently bought a house, and one of the things that we had to do was we had to check whether or not we were in the 100-year floodplain to determine whether we needed flood insurance before we could get a mortgage to buy our house. In my case, we were not in the 100-year floodplain, so I didn't have to buy flood insurance. But we had to at least check that because it's a requirement. The downside to flood insurance is that it can encourage development in dangerous areas. Once everybody is insured, and in particular because the federal government actually subsidizes flood insurance, so you're not actually paying the full value of the insurance. The federal government is helping out. That encourages development in dangerous areas because people feel like, well, I've got insurance. It will pay to replace everything if there is a flood. So it's okay for me to live in this area that's highly exposed to flooding. And on top of the insurance payouts, you also get supplements in the case of a disastrous flood from federal or state government relief aid that gets paid out when there's a serious flood event, as well as private charity that will, take donations and use them to help people that have been affected by a flood. And then you've also got evacuation. So that includes temporarily leaving an area that's threatened by a flood, or getting out once the flood has occurred, as you see in the picture there. But it also includes permanent relocation of people. If there's an area that has been deemed just too dangerous, there's too much flooding risk in this area, there may be programs that buy people out and get them to just permanently relocate out of that area, to sometimes move an entire town out of an area that has a high flood risk. The issues with evacuation are, first, it's hard to get the message out. If there is the need for an evacuation, it can be difficult to communicate that to everybody that needs to hear it. And the most vulnerable people are often the people that are least likely to get the message. If you are, for example, very poor, you may not have reliable internet access. So spreading the word via the internet may not be very effective. If you have populations that don't speak English as their main language, then any sort of evacuation warnings that are put out in English wouldn't reach those populations. So there's a lot of obstacles to getting the message out about evacuation. And then some people, they may hear the message, they may hear that evacuation is recommended or even mandated, and they may not have the ability to evacuate. They may not have the resources. If you, for example, don't own a car, you can't just hop in the car and drive away. And lots of people will sometimes end up trapped in an area that's experiencing flooding because even though they knew the flood was coming, they knew they should evacuate, they just didn't have the means to do so. And with evacuation, you always have to balance the risks and costs of calling for evacuation because floods are unpredictable. Just because you called for an evacuation doesn't necessarily mean that it will turn out to have been necessary. Maybe the storm that you thought was going to drop enormous amounts of rain and cause a huge flood will take a different track and go somewhere else, or will peter out and not drop that much rain. And so there's always that balance between not wanting to cry wolf and put people through the trouble and expense of evacuating when they didn't need to, and then they won't listen to you next time, versus the risk of if you don't call for the evacuation and there is a big flood, then that's a pretty terrible decision to have made. You can be in for a lot of liability for not having warned people and helped them get out of the way. So there's a tricky balance between the risks and costs with employing evacuation. Okay, so your lab assignment for this week. The goals of this assignment are first for you to be able to calculate flood return intervals and the peaks of floods using data similar to what we looked at with that Siletz, Oregon example earlier in the presentation. And then to evaluate the flood risk to homes. Are particular locations at risk of certain sorts of floods, and what would that mean for homeowners living in those places?